Hello, good to see you here in the Spectrum Conference and the showcase on meeting the needs of all users in the 6 gigahertz band. My name is Stefan Seele. I'm the CEO of Colliago Consulting, and we specifically looked at the 6 gigahertz band for IMT identification. I noticed earlier in the conference you had a very good presentation from Luciana from the GSMA, who looked at that band and explains what we're looking at. So it's the 1.2 gigahertz in just at the bottom or at the top of 5 gigahertz up to 7 gigahertz. So this presentation is actually based on a report. So it's a very detailed report we've done on the topic with a lot of research. And this conference material is, of course, available on the conference website. But if you would like to receive the report, please do send me an email and I'll send it to you. So what am I going to cover today? I'm going to first of all look at IMT spectrum need in the context of 5G vision. Then I look at modeling demand for area traffic capacity, and then look at demand or modeling area traffic capacity. We have the demand and supply, and I then compare demand and supplies in 5 cities and continue to look at the role of the 6 gigahertz band outside the cities, and then compare unlicensed or what's also called RLAN or Wi-Fi in that band with 5G mobile or an IMT identification, and briefly address the sharing with incumbents and then summarize. So I think we all agree, it has been said many, many times, well, we need 5G is absolutely key in realizing the fourth industrial revolution. It's the glue that holds everything together. But we do need more spectrum because much more traffic is being passed through the airwaves. And so we're looking at 5925 to 7125, which we refer to as the 6 gigahertz band, as a candidate band for that purpose. Now, the key point in our approach is that our starting point is the IMT 2020 5G requirements. And everybody has agreed to this. This is what everybody signed up to as part of being members of the ITU. And what are the key differences between 5G and 4G? Well, it is the user experienced data rate. So there's a factor of 10 increase compared to LTE Advanced. So 5G should deliver 100 megabits user experience data rate in the downlink anytime, anywhere, citywide. And then there's, of course, also the area traffic capacity. So this is to serve a large number of devices generating traffic in a small area. And here the increase is 100-fold compared to LTE-A. And so you can see that A, a massive investment is required, and B, a lot of spectrum is needed. So in that sense, 4G or LTE is not simply a continuation of the mobile business as we know it, but it is something more. Essentially, LTE was people with smartphones. Yes, there was a little bit of IoT stuff and so on. It still exists, of course, but 5G is so much more. It's enhanced mobile broadband with much higher data rate, so the 100 megabits there. It's fixed wireless access, because fixed wireless access is one of the use cases of 5G. FWA was there in 4G, but never really took off because there isn't enough spectrum, there isn't enough capacity. So with 5G, this will actually be turbocharged. And then we have the massive machine type communication and critical machine type communication. So you can see quite readily, 5G is more of a revolution than an evolution. And to that extent, to support this revolution, we do need more spectrum. Here in region 1, we have, of course, the legacy band, 700, 800, 900, and 1800, 2100, and so on. And yes, 5G is being introduced in all of those bands. And then there are the new 5G bands. Of course, in most countries, spectrum is technology neutral, and rightly so. But the point about the 3.5 or C-band and 6 gigahertz is that it is for 5G in the sense that at least in 3.5 we have specifications 3GPP for wide area in 5G, and we don't have the equivalent in 4G. And indeed, it has never been used for 3G or anything else. And then the high bands, of course, they're exclusively, or high bands are also called millimeter wave, they're exclusively 5G. So an enormous amount of spectrum coming on stream, and I will show that this is indeed required. So operators need a portfolio of spectrum, sub 1 gigahertz bands for the wide area coverage and in-building penetration, then lower mid bands, so 1.8 to 2.6 as a basic capacity layer for legacy technologies as well as 5G. And then the upper mid band, which is the 3.5, 4.5. I know that's, for example, relevant in Russia and the 4 gigahertz range because there's so little available at 3.5, and then the 6 gigahertz, which is what we are talking about. That will provide the city-wide speed coverage layer. So this is for your consistent 100 megabits in the downlink user experience and 50 megabits in the uplink. And then on top, of course, we have the high bands, but the high bands are not a substitute to the upper mid bands because it's economically not feasible to provide citywide coverage, but they are required to serve those very high density places within cities. So our starting point is then, let's not attempt to forecast how much every single application will use. In other words, that data volume driven approach. Let's look at bandwidths, because after all, the ITU requirement is one of bandwidths, and it's approaching the fixed network experience. And when you look at fixed networks, people don't buy gigabytes, they buy a user experience in terms of speed. And this is where mobile is moving towards. However, we should not confuse the 100 megabits with a guaranteed rate. So it cannot become, if you will, a license obligation in any shape or form. But it is a vision that most of the time users should experience this. So while fundamentally there is no guarantee, at least if there's sufficient network investment and if there is sufficient spectrum available, then users have a reasonably high probability to achieve that throughput speed. Okay, now let's look at how we modeled demand. So we looked at the ITU requirement. You got to deliver 100 megabits to the user. There are lots of users in cities, so we used population density as a proxy. And then we asked, well, let's make an assumption. How many users and users will demand bandwidths of that 100 megabits simultaneously? That's our concurrent demand from human and non-human users. But of course, millimeter wave plays a role, and some of the traffic is offloaded to millimeter wave sites. And that gives us our traffic demand per square kilometer measured in gigabits per square kilometer. On the supply side, we have our macro sites, we have our micro sites, we have the sectorization, the spectral efficiency, and of course, the amount of spectrum deployed on it. So that gives us the capacity supply. So we have taken into account that networks will evolve. Today, there might be few small cells, but in future, there will be many more small cells deployed in cities, adding to the capacity supply per square kilometer. Population density, as I said, is a proxy, because we can postulate that where people are, this is where the traffic will be it in shape of smartphones or other applications such as connected cars, smart city, cameras, and so on. And where you really need more spectrum is to cater for high traffic density. So we focused on cities which have a reasonably high population density. This is not necessarily an administrative area, but these are areas of high population density which may straddle administrative boundaries or just be a part of a city. Now, here's an example. France, Paris. What we're looking at here is a contour line of 17,500 people per square kilometer. That's the little dark area, or with the dark ring around it. It's quite small. It's only 85.3 square kilometers. That's Paris inside the Boulevard Périphérique. But the population density with 25,000 per square kilometer is really, really high. And it is a challenge to deliver that user experience data rate to in that population density. Now, Moscow, slightly different. Again, we identify areas of similar population density, and Moscow overall is a larger area, but the central area where you have this high density is 200 square kilometers, so larger than Paris, and the population density 21,000, almost 21,000, with 4.3 million people in that area. So that's the population density. We did a few other cities. Here's Lagos, looks slightly different, Tokyo, but that's Sao Paulo. There are many cities in the world where this is the case. And say, in fact, there's about 140 or so cities where you have population densities greater than 9,000 people per square kilometer. So this is relevant for most countries in the world as far as population density is concerned. Now, looking at the activity factor, there's a little bit of uncertainty what this is going to be. And at the moment, you could say current use is probably demanding high bandwidth is probably lowish, probably in the neighborhood of 2 to 3%. But it will certainly increase as people use their phones longer. The higher usage, the more concurrent use there will be. This is evident when you look at FTTH or DSL, which have busy periods lasting not minutes, but several hours. And so unlimited data plans are, of course, becoming common for 5G mobile. We see that in Korea and other places. And so usage will, if you allow me a colloquial place, go through the roof, and that bandwidth will be demanded. And after all, we don't have to really ask ourselves so much how we get there, because the point is, that is the specification or the requirement for 5G to deliver a user experience data rate of 100 megabits. Now, on the demand side, as I said, we need to take account of offload. Can millimeter wave be a substitute to upper midband spectrum to 6 gigahertz? And the answer is no, it's not a substitute, but it helps. It helps in those areas where traffic densities are very high, shopping malls, stadia, a very busy station. And indeed, in those areas, upper midband spectrum is not sufficient to serve the density requirement, which was also in the ITU 10 megabits per square meter. That can only be achieved with millimeter wave base. So you need both. You need more upper midband spectrum and you need millimeter wave. Now, how do we model capacity? Well, I already had it on the previous slide. We look at the macro side and the intersite distance in the city, the sectorization, typically 3 sectors, the amount of spectrum deployed on the macro, and we assume all the spectrum is deployed on all sites, and then the spectral efficiency, taking account, of course, of the higher spectral efficiency of 5G in combination with higher orders of MIMO up to and including 64 by 64 MIMO. And then on top of it, it is, I think when you look at all the forecasts, what we'll see is operators will roll out a fairly large number of small cells in cities to cater for traffic demand. But the sectorization is different, typically only one sector per site. You cannot deploy on all the spectrum on it because the sites would be too big, and the spectral efficiency tends to be different because you might not have the very high orders of MIMO because antennas would be simply, active antennas would be too heavy and big to, for example, stick on a lamppost. Anyway, taking all of that together, so as you can see, substantial investment is required even to get there. All the small cells, everything needs to be 5G and so on. But that gives you your capacity supply per square kilometer. So what assumptions have we made with regards to the spectrum? Well, and intersite distance, typically 400 meters in a city, 3 sectors, 4 bits per hertz on average in the low band spectrum. In the lower mid-band spectrum, we have a higher spectral efficiency of 8 bits per hertz, although we are now being criticized for because in reality that might be lower. So our assumptions here are actually somewhat optimistic of how much we can squeeze out of legacy spectrum. Again, we have assumed 8 bits per hertz in the downlink for 3 gigahertz, and then for the 6 gigahertz, which is what we're looking at, we examine the case for 700 megahertz or 1.2 gigahertz, again assuming 8 gigahertz, and then we make appropriate assumptions for small cells, but we have only one sector, and we assume there will be 1.8 small cells per macro site. So what we then do is we compare, we model the demand in the cities based, or area traffic demand based on population density, using that as a proxy, and with the values I just presented, area traffic capacity. And we simply compare traffic demand per square kilometer measured in gigabits per square kilometer with the capacity. And we ask ourselves whether, despite having made all the investment in small cells, despite having converted all the spectrum to 5G, because we're looking at the 2025 to 2030 timeframe, do we need additional spectrum? So let's look at the 5 cities. So as you can see, the population density from 28,000 in Lagos, 21,000 in Moscow, down to 20,000 in Tokyo. So this is the band that we are looking at, or the additional spectrum we use in our model. Okay, in that band 5925 to 7125 is potentially available for IMT. I know the WRC, only the upper, the 100 megahertz is discussed globally. The 600 megahertz is agenda item 1.2 for region 1. And the rest is open whether it should be assigned to IMT, could be used for IMT or not. The point is that the entire band is already used for IMT in China. The entire band is already used for RLAN or unlicensed in the US, as you heard earlier from Luciana. So we are now looking at the benefit of using either the 100 plus 600, so i.e. 700 megahertz in the band for IMT, or the entire 1.2 gigahertz. So the scenarios we're running are, I mean, let's focus on Moscow. We said, okay, legacy spectrum, maybe 650 megahertz. Now, Moscow suffers a little bit because in Russia, in 3.3, in that band, there's only 200 megahertz available for various reasons. So there is a little bit of a shortage of upper mid-band spectrum in Moscow, which is also the case in some other areas outside Europe. So this chart is a little bit complicated. This is where it all comes together. Now, on this chart, let me talk you through that. On the horizontal, you're seeing the population density and population per square kilometer. And you're seeing here France with 25,000. On the vertical axis, you're seeing the capacity and by implication demand in gigabits per square kilometer. And the colored line, the upward sloping colored line, that shows the capacity supply, the traffic demand, depending on whether my concurrent use is 5%, 10%, 15, 20, or 25% of population. So that's the concurrent demand. And then the horizontal line that are going across, the dotted horizontal supply, that's the capacity supply. So the lowest line, that's if there is no additional 6 gigahertz spectrum at 6 gigahertz. The dotted line above that is the capacity supply if an extra 700 megahertz is available. And then the next one gives you the capacity supply if the whole 1.2 gigahertz is available. And where the colored lines, the upper sloping colored line, the demand lines, cross these lines at the particular population density for Paris, you see whether you in fact run out of spectrum. So you can see that in Paris, if concurrent use goes above 5%, you're running out of spectrum despite having built a large number of small cells, despite having millimeter wave offload, despite having converted all the legacy spectrum to 5G. So if you get an additional 700 megahertz of spectrum in 6 gigahertz, then you could serve a concurrent use of 15%. So that would work. And if the concurrent use goes higher, then the solution is either to densify it further, which is costly, or to make more spectrum, i.e. the entire 1.2 gigahertz available for IMT. Moscow, you can see the situation is slightly different. Our population density is lower. As you can see, it's only 21,000 in those central areas, but I have less spectrum available in the upper mid-band because there's other stuff going on in the C-band. So you could argue that therefore on Moscow, despite the lower population density, the need for spectrum in the 6 gigahertz band is equally as high as it is in Paris. So, and I'm sure there are other cities in the region where this would be the case. Here are a few other pictures. Lagos, essentially it keeps showing you the same picture. Yes, more spectrum in 6 gigahertz is required, as well as increased investment in networks. And we have done that for a number of cities around the world. I'd just like to add one important point. Of course, even in places where population density is lower, additional spectrum resources are still valuable because you have to build fewer small cells. And that, of course, has environmental benefits. So the additional spectrum is not just useful in cities with a population density of greater than maybe 6,000 or 9,000 people per square kilometers, but it's relevant in all cities. And it is, of course, relevant outside cities. Outside cities, well, you don't have that demand, that mobile demand. You don't have the same density of mobile traffic. But, of course, this is where having additional spectrum to provide fixed wireless access is a key element. Fixed wireless access, as you saw earlier, is, of course, one of the 5G use cases. And indeed, FWA is growing very, very fast. It's in fact growing faster than fiber. And it's not surprising because in most cases, deploying FWA is cheaper than deploying fiber, particularly outside cities. In cities, fiber is the solution clearly, but outside cities, FWA is the solution. And here's a little forecast from the Ericsson Mobility Report. So what we are seeing is a huge trend towards FWA. Why? Because 5G makes FWA possible, fiber-like connectivity using FWA. This is something which 3G or 4G couldn't really deliver, but 5G, because of the higher orders of MIMOs and the wideband deployment and additional spectrum, makes it a solution that delivers speeds that are certainly better than DSL and competitive with fiber. Rural fiber is not possible subsidy-free. The cost is simply too high. So governments, if they have a plan to bring broadband to rural areas, they need to subsidize. And the point is that with FWA, you have to subsidize less, because using FWA to provide 100 megabits in the downlink and 50 in the uplink is considerably cheaper than doing it using fiber. There's an excellent study which has been published by the FTTH Council Europe, which shows you the cost of fiber per home passed. What you're seeing here is the household density. And you can see as household density has become lower, the cost is really becoming very, very high. So the average cost of connecting a rural household with FTTH amounts to 2,000 euros, 2,000 euros. That's under good conditions. So what we are then doing, we're comparing the business case, or is it actually possible to do it with FWA if you have more spectrum? So what we looked at is the more spectrum is available for FWA, the more we can deploy on a single cell, the more households we can serve from a site, and we can offer all of these households 100 megabits. So we looked at the required data rate, 100 megabits, 150, 300, even 1 gigabit. We applied a higher percentage of concurrent use because this is fixed-like usage, so 50%. And then we examined a baseline spectrum. Now, what is a baseline? The baseline is the same as for the mobile case, except that we are saying for FWA, only the upper midband is available. Because even in rural, of course, in towns, rural towns and villages, you do have quite a lot of mobile traffic, and people will still want the 100 megabits for mobile. So we assume that all the legacy bands, anything up to below 3.3, would be reserved for mobile use. And we can then work out how many households or premises we can support per cell tower. And you can see on this chart that the more spectrum we have here, if we have just a 3.5, we can support 220 per cell tower. This is assuming all the spectrum from all operators is deployed on a cell tower. But if we have an additional 700 megahertz, that goes up and to 381 households per tower, and it goes even to just under 500 if they have the entire band. And so you can see how efficient it gets. I run fiber to that tower, I can support a large number of households. This is really very, very efficient. The definition of broadband, of course, keeps increasing. It used to be 50. Well, some people still use 30 megabits. Then it became 50. In the EU, 100 is being used, but Ofcom, the UK regulator, is using 300. And these definitions keep increasing. So looking at then the IMT identification of the 6 gigahertz band, I think in lower GDP countries, the case is not simply a mobile case, but it is a case of bringing broadband also to rural communities using FWA. And so this is where this can be really, really important. And you're probably familiar with the Broadband Commission Sustainable Development Goals. Whilst I appreciate that some of this is not relevant in CIS and Eastern Europe, because these tend to be slightly higher GDP countries than say Africa. but nevertheless, there are areas where incomes are relatively low, and these tend to be rural areas which are not well connected, and this is where probably your development efforts focus. As you have probably heard in this conference, or will hear, that the 6 gigahertz band, there are various claims made on this. The Wi-Fi folks or RLAN people want it, and that's what the Choice US have made. And then it is extremely useful for mobile, i.e. IMT. So that is why I briefly want to compare the two. So Wi-Fi is, of course, wonderful. We all use it, and it's great, wonderful technology. It is essential to our lives. But so is 5G. The thing about Wi-Fi, it's unlicensed. 5G is licensed. Wi-Fi is an important connectivity tool, but it is not, doesn't provide mobile connectivity, and usage is limited. And Wi-Fi only provides the last hop between the devices and the broadband access network. So if you don't have a good connectivity, broadband connectivity in the first place, Wi-Fi is pretty useless. The usefulness of Wi-Fi depends on the ability of a broadband access network. So in CIS and CE countries, the unlicensed use of the 6 gigahertz band does not solve the connectivity problem. If you were to use all of the spectrum for Wi-Fi, yes, you'd have great Wi-Fi, but it's a little bit like having a modern 8-lane motorway, which would be the Wi-Fi bit, and which ends in a dusty 1-lane country road. There is no point. There is no point in having brilliant Wi-Fi speed when you're connected to a slow DSL connection. So the bottleneck is really the access network, and this is why using the spectrum to solve the access bottleneck makes sense, makes economic sense. And as you can see from this chart, these are measures taken by OpenSignal. In most countries, 5G download speeds are now better, significantly better than Wi-Fi download speeds. Of course, they're better than 4G, and Wi-Fi was better than 4G. But what changes with 5G? That 5G now delivers these higher download speeds. And in fact, a lot of people say, well, there's all this, why do they need more spectrum? Because we can offload to Wi-Fi. But Wi-Fi offload is declining. The biggest trend is Wi-Fi onloading. So what people are doing, they're buying these little MiFi routers or these little devices which are connected to 4G and 5G mobile network and have Wi-Fi at the other side. So in fact, Wi-Fi onload is what's growing, and Wi-Fi offload is declining. So for the most of the world's countries and most of the world population, an IMT identification of the 6 gigahertz will deliver better socioeconomic benefits compared to the unlicensed Wi-Fi use of the band. So in short, doing what America has been doing, they've done it for their purpose. They have a very well developed broadband infrastructure. There's lots of fiber around, and they took that route to suit their situation. But their situation is not the same in most other countries. Well, certainly not in most CE countries, nor in other Region 1 countries. Maybe in Europe, fine, but it is a different situation. So following what the US has been doing, I don't think it's necessarily a good idea. They jumped the gun on it. And indeed, I spoke to operators, mobile operators in the US, who are very, very unhappy with that. They would like some of that spectrum to cater for the high density traffic densities in places like Chicago and of course New York. So there are many other technical advantages. The IMT irradiation power on macrosites will be more effective way of providing broadband access to people than that of low power Wi-Fi. So if a band coexistence concession is allowed, then IMT deployment is the first priority. I briefly want to address the issue of sharing with incumbents. These studies are currently ongoing, but the initial results are quite encouraging. And indeed, coexistence is, of course, an issue both for Wi-Fi or for unlicensed use as well as for licensed use. And if use is licensed, the benefit is, of course, that you know who are the users and where are the users, i.e. the mobile operators. So coexistence planning is far easier in a licensed environment. And as I said, the early results are encouraging that coexistence does work. So let me just summarize the key findings. So in developed countries with good wide broadband, as well as developing countries or less developed countries, the having additional upper midband spectrum from the 6 gigahertz band, either 700 or possibly the entire band, using it for IMT, would allow the 100 megabits data rate to be delivered citywide, urban and suburban. It does ensure that fixed wireless broadband is a long-term solution because sufficient spectrum is available to support a good number of households with 100 megabits or more. And the lower cost for urban FWA overcomes the lack of fiber or DSL broadband access. And by the way, in this context, what is the next or the really big event which people sometimes forget about? The big event that's going on over the next 3 to 7 years is copper switch off. So the only thing that will be left to provide access essentially is FTTH and FWA. So these are the two options. In some places, of course, you have cable networks, cable TV, but in most places, it's really a choice between FWA and fiber. And this is why additional spectrum is so useful. Because FWA broadband economics work much better with more spectrum, and it helps to bridge the urban-rural digital divide. It also helps to deliver the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And we have also examined the use of more upper midband spectrum on highways. And here it is very useful as well, because connected cars consume an enormous amount of data, and you couldn't possibly do that in millimeter wave site. So, and it contributes to reaching the ITU and UNESCO Broadband Commission 2025 targets. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. I have a few questions here. So I can now maybe respond to a few of those. There's something here about, yes, that spectrum has already been allocated to unlicensed in the US, South Korea, and Chile. That's absolutely correct. However, there are also places where this isn't the case, notably China with a population of 1.2 billion, and many other countries are actually discussing this. So particularly I found a lot of interest in Africa and also other Latin American countries, including, for example, Colombia, Brazil, and so on. Yeah, so there's a question of 5925 to 6425, which is lower bit candidate band for IMT. Perhaps it's not quite right to call it a candidate band for IMT, because you won't get an IMT identification at WRC level, but nevertheless, of course, it has a mobile. There's a primary identification for mobile, fixed and fixed satellite. So from an ITU's perspective, countries can do that. The question is there an ecosystem? And given that China is proposing to use the entire band for IMT, we'll certainly see a very good ecosystem within that. So are there any other questions? If not, I can just repeat, please, if you would like to receive the report, because of course, so much more to say on this topic, please do send me an email. And then I would also like to mention that there is we just in the final stages of, we finalized a new report specifically looking at the need for additional spectrum in Europe, where we also examine or have data not just for the downlink, but also the uplink, and dug into a little bit more detail. So that report is likely to be available later this week or early next week. And in February, we'll widen the study to at a global level and include many more cities around the world, and consider other aspects, including the savings that can be achieved by having additional spectrum. For example, in Europe, the FTTH Council numbers show that the cost of delivering the target, the European Union target of making 100 megabits available to all households, if you do it with fiber, it is possible, but it requires a lot of investment. Investment is of course required, but if you use in rural, if you use FWA and you have the additional spectrum available, you can say the subsidy saving will be roughly 42 billion euros. And that's not a small sum, I would say. And especially these days, cash-strapped governments would be happy to save on that. So that is an example on how spectrum or the identification, an IMT identification, or at least 700 megahertz in region 1 in 6 gigahertz would deliver enormous socioeconomic benefits. And with that, I conclude. So if what do we have? I guess we are almost out. So I understand there are no further questions. So thank you very much for joining, and please do send me an email if you want the report. Thank you. Bye-bye.